In the last section, we showed that achieving financial independence is really just math. Through early savings and compounding interest, you can build a sufficient net worth that you're ultimately able to live off your passive income. And it shouldn't be that hard to get there. I wanted to further that argument by looking at a recent study on the demographics of millionaires. This study was put on by Chris Hogan in tandem with Dave Ramsey, who's a well-known financial advocate. The study shows that it's not just the privileged elite who can become millionaires. It's common, everyday people who are disciplined with their money, goal-oriented, and intentional with their decisions. So that can be you. There's no barrier to entry to become a millionaire or to achieving financial independence early. The results showed that millionaires are everyday people. They just make focused and intentional financial decisions and lifestyle choices. 62% had an average household income of less than $100,000. So clearly, you don't need to make a tremendous salary to achieve millionaire status or become financially independent. The top 5 occupations were engineer, accountant, teacher, management, and lawyer. Teacher obviously is not known for being a well-paying profession, and even accountants and management aren't known for their high salaries. 18% of millionaires are self-employed, which over-indexes versus just 10% of the general population. Most millionaires chose a classic investments like mutual funds that we'll talk about later and real estate, although much of the real estate was tied up in an individual's primary residence. They invested consistently over time and were goal-oriented and intentional with their money. They tended to hire a strong team of financial planners, accountants, and other professionals around them. These are people who had expertise in areas that they didn't necessarily have. 73% have never held credit card debt, and 70% had no student loan debt. That second stat really makes you think about what you want to do with your college spending, given the exorbitant cost of a college education today. Not saying you can't go to college, but just be aware of the debt you're racking up, because it could potentially be worth $250 million in the long run. Finally, the stat I like most was that they spent $35 on a pair of jeans on average, showing that they aren't necessarily letting their wealth get to their heads. You can check out more in the book, but this basic overview should give you the perception that millionaires aren't necessarily just the privileged elite, and it's an entirely achievable status. In this lecture, we'll discuss how the FI lifestyle differs from the traditional one and what's appealing about it. In other words, why pursue financial independence? Often we don't spend time reflecting on what's important to us by asking questions like, how do you want to spend the majority of your time? What's most important to you? How do you want to be remembered? And the other ones listed below. One of the most important ones to the FI movement is it worth it to have a stressful, time-consuming career in order to fund a certain lifestyle? There are no wrong answers to these questions, but we should be aware of our goals and make our decisions, financial and otherwise, accordingly. Every decision we make is a trade-off. Because time and money are 2 of our most valuable resources, if we're to sacrifice them, we want to be sure we're doing so for the right reasons. Let's look at an example of a FI lifestyle. Pete graduated college when he was 22 and started a job with a beginning salary of $60K. Over his career, he earned consistent raises and several promotions. Pete spent most of his money on what he needed while enjoying some luxuries. He lived with roommates until his late 20s, purchased and drove a used Honda, and bought and moved into a modest home when he married his wife at age 29. Throughout this time, he didn't deprive himself, and he made intentional financial decisions. By controlling his wants and not succumbing to lifestyle inflation, Pete saved over half of his income. By age 32, he and his wife had accumulated a net worth of $1.1 million and tracked their annual expenses to be $40,000. When Pete did the math, he realized he was financially independent. Their nest egg easily adhered to the 4% rule, which we'll go into in much greater depth in a later section. And he and his wife could feel confident knowing that if they stopped working, the passive income from their nest egg, if invested correctly, would sustain their lifestyle. So can it really be that easy? Yes, it can. Pete's scenario may seem lofty, and you may have doubt that diligent savings can lead to financial freedom so early in life. That's only because the traditional mindset has warped us into thinking that we need to work for 40 years to be able to finally spend the majority of our time enjoying our lives. The fact is that achieving FI is really just math, as we can see on this slide. The below chart maps out the path to financial independence for a 22-year-old college graduate starting with no savings. Let's say this is Pete's path. It assumes a modest starting salary at 60K, 3% effective annual raises, a 5% annual bonus, and a 20% effective tax rate. Most of these are conservative assumptions. The scenario assumes that he starts saving 50% of his initial salary and only lets his expenses rise 1% each year, and it assumes a 6.6% rate of return. We'll discuss why we chose this number later, but it's an entirely realistic number. Year 1 is the starting point. After paying taxes on his 60K income, half of the remaining 50K is used to cover expenses, while he saves the other half, so his net worth at the end of year 1 is 25K. By year 5, his salary has increased 3% each year, and he now makes 70K, almost 58K after taxes. However, despite his salary increases, he hasn't let his lifestyle increase dramatically. His expenses have increased only 1% each year, so he's able to save more than half of his after-tax income, 32K. That savings, combined with savings from the previous 5 years with compounding returns, makes his net worth $200,000. In 5 years of working, through diligent saving, prudent investing, and compounding interest, he's amassed a net worth of 200 grand. Skipping ahead to year 13, Pete has continued this model, and by the end of the year, he has a net worth of over 700K. When he runs the numbers, he realizes that per a standard retirement guideline known as the 4% rule, he is financially independent and can quote-unquote retire if he chooses to do so. His passive income will support the current lifestyle he currently leads. Of course, if he'd like to lead a more luxurious lifestyle, or if he enjoys his work, he can continue, but it's an option, not a necessity. Pete's scenario shows how saving for financial independence really is just a math equation. And while it is based on assumptions, the assumptions we've made are conservative. A 60K starting salary is modest, and it doesn't take into account any additional compensation like stock options or consulting work, or even Social Security he may receive later in life. The scenario assumes modest 3% salary growth and doesn't assume any promotions along the way. The tax rate used is likely far higher than it will actually be, especially if Pete makes use of tax-advantaged retirement accounts. Any of these benefits will only decrease Pete's time to reach financial independence. So, what did we learn from this example? First, financial independence can be done. It's not some magic scenario or flimsy scheme. It's really just the math of savings, expenses, net worth, and investment growth. Second, you don't need a high salary to achieve FI. Of course, having a high salary will only help. And third, controlling your expenses is key. To achieve FI, refrain from allowing your expenses to inflate with your salary.